All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening, my name is Kings Limba. I'm a member of FGCE97 set, and you're welcome to the maiden edition of the Assembly. The Assembly is an initiative of FGCE97 set to start a lecture series and panel sessions to enhance group learning, promote networking and general awareness across different fields, and to help us to identify each other with our skills and competencies, and for those that have switched careers, for us to understand what to do. At the same time, the word assembly reminds us of that final assembly we had in 1997, when we were given several words of wisdom after several years of experience with our seniors, juniors, and environment, controls, and all those stuff. And flash forward to 23 years later, what matters was not in the context late Chief Silas Nnamonu said those things, nor the experiences we had before those things that were said. However, it was about how we've applied them to become the wonderful people that we are today. I am proud to say that by the help of Almighty, none of the 97 said people have made the evening news for the wrong reasons. So which means that final assembly was effective. In that light, we've decided to reconstitute another assembly to usher us into this new decade amidst this very quick to change situations, amidst the pandemic situations, amidst the turbulence and difficulties in understanding the trajectory of growth that the world is going for, even in the very short term. So this series is from different fields. The first, which is the maiden edition of this, is COVID-19 Insights into Pandemic and Survival Strategies for the 97 set. The topic of today's discussion is going to be economic and business opportunities, as well as safe havens during COVID-19. It's not lost on us that on January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. A few weeks later, I think it was about on March 11th, it was officially designated a global pandemic, effectively activating a bouquet of protocols and pandemic response from nations that have changed the way people do business, the way we interact, and possibly will change the way we live going forward. It's in this context that we've started this lecture series. What can we do to optimize our opportunities, to take advantage of the government stimulus? And how long will this last, and how will it affect our country? We've lined up 3 professionals from their respective fields. Our first is Mr. Ali Akuta, who is an oil and gas specialist. He was a former derivatives trader, oil and gas derivatives trader in Deutsche Bank, and was a former director at Tetra Tech and currently a director at New Advisory. We'll be talking on global impact of COVID-19 on oil and gas industry and outlook for OPEC countries. The second speaker is Mr. Okeo Mano, a friend of mine from Central Bank, but he's currently the acting chief economist at the Security and Exchange Commission. Okeo will be bringing the discussion down to Nigerian level to now say what is the Central Bank and NISAL doing regarding COVID-19 and how we can optimize that opportunity, either as household, small and medium scale enterprises, what are the criteria? And at the end of the discussion, we're going to circulate the most recent CBN's communication regarding the 50 billion stimulus and how we can assess them. It's a 6-page document, and I think we should have it handy and see how we can optimize that opportunity. Then the last speaker is Mr. Victor Ndokuba, the Deputy Managing Director of AfriInvest West Africa. Victor is going to take it to the direction of those that have excess change and want to increase their network in this opportunity. If you still have a risk appetite, Victor is going to be talking about Nigerian investment climate amid COVID-19. In that light, we would like to proceed, but I would like to read the ground rules. First, we have 10 minutes each for each of the speakers, and sequel to the presentation session, we're going to have a panel session where everybody's going to bring in their questions and we'll discuss it on a panel level. Now, the question and answer session is going to be organized in a first come, first serve basis, in which case we expect everyone to send in their questions on time and observe due protocol. Now, what's going to happen in the first the question and answer situation is that if your name is called twice and for some reason we couldn't get you to unmute on time, we probably will move to the next person and get the individual back on the queue later on. The questions will be with regards to the context of things that have been explained today. And if there are questions where we may need to schedule another lecture or another discussion or provide offline materials, we'll try to do that. We drop your email with the organizers and we'll find a way to get information across to you. On this note, I would like to proceed to the first speaker, Mr. Ali, to share his screen and start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. First of all, I hope everyone is well and staying safe in these very difficult times. You know, the whole quarantine situation has been quite a bit of a challenge, but I think a lot of people are moving through quite well. Kingsley, are you sharing the screen with the presentation, or should I?
No, you share your own screen, Ali. Yeah, we can see your screen.
You can see it now?
Give me a second.
Here we go.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Okay. So first of all, just to introduce myself. So I've been in oil and gas trade for the past 13, 14 years now. Starting off in derivatives trading, but also actually doing a lot of asset acquisitions and dispersals in the oil and gas space. From a corporate finance background. So when we're looking at oil and gas, I think on this presentation, we're going to predominantly focus on oil, given that the hits have predominantly been there. And we can discuss a little bit about gas as well. So we'll look at the impact on the oil market itself, how that relates to the economic impacts, the risks and challenges going forward, what to look out for recovery signals, especially when it's positioning yourself for investment opportunities in the oil and gas space, as well as the way forward for existing operations and opportunities. So first of all, as a backdrop, you know, as many of you I'm sure are aware, what happened in WTI last month, going into negative pricing. Just to give a bit of a background, you know, obviously since the COVID situation occurred, we've had hugely lower consumption from less industry, less air travel, less anything really. Demand for refined products has fallen through the floor. We first witnessed this from the Chinese, and then it whittled through the world. In the meantime, we had the Saudi-Russian price wars, you know, constantly pumping to unprecedented highs, creating an increase in surplus, supply surplus, and stockpiling occurred. And so the prices collapsed, but what really drove it was the lack of storage. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll just quickly look through some of the metrics here. So you can see that the inventory changes month on month since Q4, which was initially from the Chinese side, and then in the beginning of Q1, the rest of the world. The surplus led to increased storing capacity, or not capacity, but people storing the oil that was being produced without any off-takers actually utilizing the oil. And so therefore what we had was the oil inventories came down to 1.8 billion barrels in storage. That is pretty much on the brink of global capacity. And so what effectively was happening was, at one point late last month, there was literally only 1% of global storage available to put oil. People don't know where to put it. And so what we saw was futures going into the negative.
Hey, Mark, please, can you use, Ali, can you use presentation mode? Can you enlarge your screen?
1 second. Can you see the presentation mode or? Okay, can you see that? Okay. So ultimately the storage was hitting a brink, and there was nowhere to put your oil, especially in the US, which is why WTI went down. A lot of the ETFs had heavy exposure. 25% of ETFs was 25% of oil futures were actually owned by one particular ETF for May delivery, sorry, April delivery. And in fact, next month, what we have is the same ETF actually holds 35% of Brent. So we could potentially expect the same thing occurring in Brent. So when we look at the economic impact, the fiscal break-evens, given the current pricing situation, means that the oil prices needed for the budgets really has gone up. So Nigeria is around about $150 a barrel. Given where we're trading now, it's very far away. In fact, there's no country right now which is creating a fiscal break-even, which is really going to hit fiscal budgets going forward. And then obviously the cash cost of oil, there are some countries which produce at a very low cost, like Saudi Arabia, who are still profitable, even in these current circumstances. Nigeria also is relatively on the verge of break even, we can say, given that the spot market right now just hit 20 last week, so it's starting to recover. But generally, the economic impact, what we're seeing is, although a low oil price is good for consumers, the oil producing economies, you're seeing a whittle down effect of a breakdown in labor, ceasing of operations, pulling back of exploration. And so these are all effectively going through to the job market, as well as the fiscal budget that we're invested into new projects outside of oil and gas. So challenges going forward in the oil and gas business, in particularly, the obvious one is revenues. The lack of revenue is going to cause serious disruption. We're already seeing that now with a lot of the big oil majors announcing huge hundreds of millions of dollar losses. It's going to make people, historically, even from 2014, when we had the price collapse down to $27 in Brent, fundraising for new projects dried up. There was no capital available, and it was very difficult to find financing for new projects. Sustainability and survival is a key thing here. A lot of oil companies, especially the majors, they have very high operating cost per barrel. The smaller independents actually are a bit more nimble in this respect, because they're able to reduce their costs quite quickly. The protection of employees. One thing that we don't notice about, especially related to COVID, is how do employees continue to operate in a safe manner when a lot of the time they are confined to, let's say, camps that are close to the oil rigs, to the oil sites. And if there's one infection, that can spread through the whole workforce and rendering that workforce immobile. And we're seeing actually a lot of that more in the downstream sector in gas. I have plenty of examples in that. The other one is getting the oil and gas businesses to be prepared by provision of PPE and safety requirements, which is currently, I think, is lagging. Mobility to be able to counter this has been a bit slow. we'll skip over the next, just mindful of time. So then we've got the macro challenges. Obviously, the oil and gas companies will be undergoing mass layoffs, and often in oil-producing countries, the GDP and the employment force is linked quite heavily to oil and gas work. Maintaining of fiscal budgets and the financing of non-oil sector projects. The impact on credit ratings, we've already seen many countries being downgraded with the negative GDPs that are occurring right now, in particular for oil-producing countries. And reevaluation of assets. So a lot of the time when you're counting on assets, say reserves values of several billions, now they're going to be reevaluated, and ultimately your economic reserves may actually go down. Then the challenge of recovery. What's the ability to be able to recover from prolonged pandemic? Now, right now, people are envisaging, recovery will be in the next 6 months, but realistically, if this, for every month this pandemic continues, the recovery rate is going to prolong further and further, and the damage will be exponentially greater, especially in gas, I would say more so than oil actually, in particular in the downstream side. Lack of strategy. There's no real strategies. Many countries and many companies say they have a strategy, but it's something that's been put together very quickly. Having had first-hand reviews of many of these strategies, they are scratching the surface and not well prepared for a prolonged situation. The reliance, so the other thing is obviously vultures are out there, whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, people are looking at picking up cheap assets. In a distress situation, countries and companies may look to dispose of assets just to raise some liquid capital, and this is when, historically, this is when the vultures swoop in. And especially for oil-producing countries, the last thing people want to do is give away their key assets, their crown jewels, to a foreign nation, and then lose all that future revenue just because they couldn't manage it today. And then the ability to raise capital for future development, and the development of other sectors. So factors to look out for. Obviously, we know that the OPEC Plus signed up a deal. It seems that it's going okay for now. Nigeria's contribution to that deal is 400,000 barrels per oil per day reduction out of the 9.7 million that's expected to be realized. And in fact, if we just quickly go back up to the chart, even a 9.7 million barrel per day reduction is not quite enough to address the current surplus in the market. And this is what I mean about the longevity of it and the need for planning. Where is it? Okay. Then we've got the COVID-19 recovery. As I said, every month that goes on, and every month the necessary measures are not taken, this is really hitting the industry and the rest of the economy, not just oil, but many other sectors, very badly. And the ability to turn it around and recover will really be contingent upon how quickly the COVID situation is addressed. So factors to look out for is how quick other countries are turning it around. Germany are doing a fantastic job. The UAE is doing a good job. I'm sitting here in Dubai and they're doing a very good job. Countries like Italy are surprisingly still haven't really turned it around yet. And so the worry is there's no real pattern here other than, what levels the countries are actually investing in turning it around, and the population's willingness to adhere to the restrictions. And then consumption. When is air travel going to start again? When are people going to go back to their normal lives? When does the industry start picking up again? What's going on with global stimulus? Is it going to be enough? In fact, all these big numbers being announced given the damage that's being done to the economies, it may not be enough. And so there really needs to be a strong catalyst here to push. And to be able to determine that is the next question, to identify whether it's really going to be a real opportunity or whether it's just going to be something that's, just for visuals, for political visuals. And then we look at the opportunities themselves. I mean, historically, when you're looking at the current environment, obviously there are opportunities. As I said, the vultures who come in, well, why not have these opportunities for local businessmen? Why not have these opportunities to leverage what you have and see what can be done about it, using this time of downturn as an opportunity itself to leapfrog, whether it be in technology, whether it be in improvements and optimization, while things are quiet, while things are down, utilize it. Now, for example, back in 2014, I was advising a client, and we managed to get our OPEC down from $26 a barrel down to $9 a barrel because we used the opportunity of lower prices to shut in our wells and revamp the whole operational cycle. Look at areas of acquisition, or for independents, where they can potentially pick up some distressed assets and cheap assets from distressed companies, or consolidate, mergers, companies that will be looking to try and reduce their overheads to try and reduce overall costs, but then also provide some added value, some real shareholder value there. And lastly, strategy. Looking at this opportunity to develop strategies, and those strategies could be in a range of things, whether it's going to be looking at the protection of critical infrastructure, looking at health and safety protocols, and as I mentioned before, the idea of leapfrogging and potential use of derivatives to prevent any future damage going forward, especially if it's prolonged. So that's from my side. Obviously, I tried to go through quite quickly. It's a very wide discussion. We didn't touch on gas so much. We didn't touch on the downstream sectors. Downstream sectors are really suffering as well, but then it all whittles up towards the upstream anyway. But I'll open it up to discussions, or Kingsley, I'll return the floor back to you.
All right, thank you, Ali. Thank you very much, Ali. I think the most important thing you mentioned there was the lack of clarity as to when exactly it's going to end, because we don't know when the pandemic is going to come to an abrupt end, you understand? So I see it as something we need to be very, very careful with. It could end up being a W curve rather than a V curve. And we may end up going back home the second time if we get released sometime soon. So let's just fold our hands and see what happens in the industry. Well, as at the moment, let's move to the next speaker, who's going to talk to us about what the Central Bank of Nigeria is doing. They recently released 50 billion naira stimulus, how we can leverage that position, the opportunity, and also the criteria, the requirements. And do note, like I mentioned earlier, just in case you dialed in, that a copy of the presentation and also the circular will be given to everybody. Just drop your email with the organizers and we'll send a copy of the information to you. So I'll call upon Mr. Oke Omano, the Acting Chief Economist, Security and Exchange Commission, to make his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kingsley. Good evening, everyone.
Hello, okay. We are not seeing yours. Okay, it's better now. We can see your screen now.
by way of background, I have been a regulator.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time,
Past,
it looks like you're having a problem hearing, okay? What we're going to do is to move to the next speaker while I go offline.
Nigeria.
So we're going to move to the next. Hello, okay, can you hear me?
The central bank and now at
Okay, guys, please just sorry for the transmission problem with okay. I have a copy of his slide. If we can't get okay to come online, then one of us might take the presentation. Well, let's move to Mr. Victor Ndukuba, the Deputy Managing Director, AfriInvest. He's going to be speaking to us on the investment opportunities in the current climate within Nigeria. Thank you, Victor. You can share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Kingsley, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be given this opportunity to discuss investments within the COVID era, as it is. So if you give me a minute, I will just pull up my screen. And let me just make it a full presentation mode. Okay, so my presentation essentially is going to be looking at Nigeria's investment climate amid COVID-19. And I have broken this presentation down into 3 sections. To set the backdrop, I will be discussing, I'll try and shed some light as to the structure of the Nigerian economy and how vulnerable it is to external shocks. The second section would then look at the current macro picture and what the critical imperatives are. And the final section will be the core of the meat of the presentation, which is really where to invest in Nigeria in 2020. So very quickly moving on, section 1. I think the first point to make is that the business cycle the business cycle itself is one that goes up and down. It's a cyclical thing and it's recurring. So what I've done here is show a chart that looks at the economy, 3 metrics: inflation, unemployment, and economic growth over the last 10 years. As you can see, there have been periods of up and down, slowdowns and recoveries. And this has perhaps been one of the most turbulent times in Nigeria's history. This next slide essentially talks specifically to the transmission channels for external shocks in Nigeria. So starting at the top left corner, you can see where we have external shocks. In this case, we have had 3 major ones in the last 12 years or so. The oil price crash of 2014 perhaps is the one that before now was most recent in our memory. Before that, there was the 2008-2009 financial crisis triggered by the mortgage crisis in the US. COVID-19 has proven to be a whole new ball game because it's a health crisis that has triggered both a financial as well as economic crisis. It's worsened what is essentially the oil price dynamics. We listened to Ali speak very intelligently and very eloquently about what's happened with demand for oil and how it's crashed and essentially created a tailspin for the rest of the economy. COVID essentially came at a time when we had the conflict between Russia and Saudi Arabia with respect to production volumes and cuts and trying to essentially protect their market share. And what it has done, it has taken away nearly a third, at least 30% perhaps, of global oil demand because the entire aviation industry is on lockdown. And with it, we've seen the entire hospitality industry also go into a lockdown. Hotels are not open; they're not serving travelers, whether business or leisure. The entire hospitality industry is shut down completely, and that's a major grouth. In all the major economies, people are all locked in their homes because everyone is being shut in to, as it were, lower the curve. But what that means is, for example, most of us have been, in our houses for 4 to 5 weeks now, parked with our cars with full tanks of fuel, haven't gone anywhere, and therefore clearly there's been no demand from us for that. What does it mean? So weaker oil prices essentially do two things. It reduces supply of income to the government on the one hand, and impacts foreign trade negatively. Foreign investments will typically weaken because more often than not, Nigeria is perceived as an oil play. And both of those contribute to essentially eroding the reserves and create a tailspin of a problem where we see it becomes evident with currency devaluation. On the other hand, on the domestic side, the crash in revenues on the government side puts at risk its, what's that program called? The amnesty program that manages some of the restiveness in the Delta. Consequentially, where the income levels drop and government is unable to sustain its intervention through those programs, we risk seeing the return of some insurrection. So whereas what we're suffering today is a double whammy of a price collapse as well as inability to sell volumes of crude, it might actually go ahead to impair the actual capacity of the companies operating in the region to actually produce. Agriculture obviously will be impacted. And as you may know, agriculture is a key component of our inflation components, and that's one of the challenges we have. How fragile is the Nigerian economy? I think I have two sets of data here. On the left, you see the Nigerian economy, which for all intents and purposes is actually quite considerably more diversified in today than it was some 20 years ago, 2000. When we look at the contribution of oil to GDP, it used to be as high as 25.5%, potentially 30%, inching towards 30% as of 2000. Now it's down to 8.8%. However, the challenge with the economy really is the fact that it continues to be a key contributor to FX earnings. So as you can see from the top right, in 2000, it accounted for $15.6 billion of earnings, which was about 84% of total revenues, at the time. As of last year, it's down slightly to 14.2 billion, but still accounted for nearly 58.3% of aggregate revenues. At the bottom half of the page, to the bottom right, when you look at oil exports, we can see, sorry, if you just give me a minute, I need to minimize this. So oil exports as a share of total, in 2000, oil exports alone were about $18.8 billion. It's actually significantly improved. Our total exports have gone up, but it's still slightly down to about 83.9%. So roughly 84% of revenues exports. On page 7, we then see, and again, I've looked at three of the most recent shocks. We're in the current one, which is the extreme right. But the global financial crisis of 2008/9, we saw external reserves, decline by nearly 35%, from 54.2 billion to about $42.3 billion. And the impact on the exchange rate was a 20% loss of value for the naira, which went from 118.5 naira to the dollar to about 148.9. When we saw the crash of 2004, we saw a similar decline in the reserves. So it went down from about $40.7 billion to roughly $27 billion, a decline of nearly 34%. Again, the consequential impact of that decline, of that crisis, was that we nearly lost half of our purchasing power for the average Nigerian, going from 157.3 naira to the dollar to about 305. And these are official numbers, clearly. During the current pandemic, which has more or less only taken up the first quarter of this year, and more importantly, has only really impacted for the last 6 weeks, we've seen the reserves come under severe strain. It's down 12.4% in the space of nearly 4 months. And the exchange rate itself has been adjusted by the central bank. So we've seen the official go from 305 to 360, whereas the I&E window, we've seen the rates go from 360 to about 383, a 5.2% depreciation. Now, what are the impact of these external shocks and how do they impact the Nigerian economy? So 3 broad buckets. Households, the economic shocks clearly would have a big impact. We're going to see a retrenchment in income levels. Some of you may have heard the video clip by the CEO of Access Bank and some of the controversy surrounding it. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, those are very stark realities that we will all be confronting. We expect to see companies begin to cut back on salaries where they can, and if they are unable to contain their costs, they might actually go ahead to lay people off. So we'll begin to see unemployment begin to rise. Inflation, we expect, might also kick in, given the impact of the lower naira, the devaluation of the naira, and what it means, considering that a lot of the invisible goods, technology goods, and some core foods we consume are imported. We will also see weaker diaspora remittances, both local and diaspora actually, because even within the country, we have local remittances from people in the cities to people in the hinterlands. On the government side, I think we've already talked about the fact that revenues are going to come under challenge, and therefore public spending on public goods will be strained. We expect government to borrow more because clearly there's going to be a larger deficit to fund. Debt sustainability pressures are going to be further enhanced. In the lead up to 2019, I know there was a slight downward adjustment, but for some of us who've been tracking the data, we saw government debt service obligations as a percentage of revenues climb from nearly 30% to as much as 71% if you add certain non-quantitative measures such as the CBN's ways and means. Some estimates suggest that those numbers can begin to push 75% given the current situation. It's not looking very rosy. The last bucket here talks about businesses. So businesses are also going to face the challenge of weaker revenues, due obviously to lower disposable income and therefore lower consumption spending. Operating costs are already set at a level where income levels were prior to the crisis, and therefore they will begin to look for ways to curtail those operating costs. For businesses in the services industry, where it is human capital that drives it, the easiest way to adjust those costs is really to lower salaries. Business investment itself is going to weaken. I do not foresee a scenario where businesses will go gung-ho in trying to expand capacity, either from services or from actually production capacity. Cost of debt should go up, I would think, especially dollar denominated. And we may actually begin to witness some level of bankruptcies. Ultimately, all of these put together create a very uncharitable picture of what the economy looks like. We expect to see the economic performance of the country deteriorate. The second section, and I'll go through this very quickly, is just essentially painting a picture of the macro scenario and what critical imperatives there are for Nigeria. The charts here are 4. One looks at economic growth, GDP, top left corner. We saw modest recovery after the recession of 2016. Those growth rates, 0.8, 1.9, and 2.3, were suboptimal because they lagged population growth, which is estimated at between 2.7 and 3%. So we weren't growing quite fast enough. And what that means in real terms is that we're actually creating, since we're not growing as fast as the economy, since the economy wasn't growing as fast as population was growing, we're actually creating more poor people. Sadly, 2020 has come with, a major, body blow to Nigeria. And my research analysts estimate that we will see a contraction of nearly 8%. What happens to inflation, given that we've seen an adjustment in VAT from 5% to 7.5%? There's an expected adjustment in the tariff for electricity up It was initially slated to kick off 1st of April. It's been moved forward by another 3 months. And then the impact of devaluation. So we have three, very strong tailwinds here, headwinds rather. Exchange rate obviously has moved. Our analysts think once the CBN reopens supply to the market, we may see a bit of a moderation in the spreads where the dollar is currently trading at about 450 to about 415. But whatever the case may be, that's a major adjustment, nearly 60 now from where we were for on average through 2019 and for the last 3 years or so. Unemployment numbers, caveat here, the last set of data we had was as at Q1 2018, Q3 2018. Afterwards, the NBS was unable to continue to keep up with that data because of challenges with funding. But we saw unemployment go essentially from about 8.5% in 2015 to about 23%. I don't think any one of us needs a crystal ball to imagine what happens with unemployment coming to 2020. The federal government has had to revisit its budget on slide 11. On the left, you have at the top what the budget assumptions were prior to COVID, 2.2 million barrels a day production levels, exchange rate at 305, and oil price average set at $57 a barrel. The initial adjustments, production volumes dropped to 1.7, exchange rate official moved to 360, and a benchmark price of $30 a barrel. We've seen a lot of volatility there, and I think the jury is out as to where those numbers will settle. On the right, what is the impact of the adjustments on the key headline numbers? Revenue was set at 8.4 trillion prior to COVID, with 6 trillion of total expenditure and a deficit of 2.2 trillion. To at least half. But there's a bit of some respite there, I think, on account of adjustments in the baseline exchange rate. Revenues is expected to drop to 5.1 trillion, but expenditure will still remain at 10.3, with a much larger fiscal deficit. How significant will the fallout of this be on FG's finances? So if you look at the charts here, therefore, top left corner, we're essentially showing what the revenues would be against expenditure. It's one thing to budget, another thing to actually hit the numbers. Last year, revenue targets were set at 7.5 trillion. Actual numbers came at 4.2. We think those numbers are going to halve to about 2.1 trillion, whereas expenditure will remain at the same levels, which obviously explains why we think there's going to be a much larger deficit and therefore higher borrowings. Government support to the overall economy will be limited due to high non-discretionary spending. So on the right, you see that. On the bottom left, fiscal deficit is going to spike to record levels, obviously due to high expenditure. And this is, of course, despite weak revenues. We've already seen certain reactions already. And in the last 2 days, we've heard the president had approved the implementation of the Steve Orosanye report, which was commissioned under the Jonathan administration in about 2012, and with a view to rationalizing the number of ministries, departments, and agencies, which at the time was about 500. But understand the numbers today is about 1,200. So we have quite a bit of work cut out for us. It is not something that can happen in the short term, which is why we think that expenditure will remain at the same level. And depending on how radical this mastectomy might be, we could see some impact begin to kick in 2021. Bottom right, increased borrowing from domestic and foreign sources to plug the deficit. Although we've seen the government, through the Ministry of Finance, repurpose some of its initial plans to borrow from external sources to increasing what it plans to borrow locally, and I think that's the way to go. What does in this situation, essentially, on the fiscal policy side, we depleted our savings, so we have very little buffers today to manage. The central bank also continued to fund federal government through monetizing some of its shortages and deficits. We have severely underfunded healthcare and education, and as COVID has now shown us up, we need to really get back to fixing those two critical health development indices. Sustained energy subsidies. We've enjoyed subsidies, on two levels, both in terms of the power industry, given the tariffs that operate, as well as petroleum, particularly premium motor spirit, or petrol as we call it. On the monetary side, the lack of a fixed exchange rate, maintaining a fixed peg on the currency and multiple channels helped to weaken what would have been a much more robust build-up in reserves. And high dependence on foreign portfolio investors meant that we were essentially subject to the vagaries of short-term fiscal portfolio flows. The government has responded by publishing a couple of measures, short-term measures, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. So on the fiscal side, we've seen some stimulus come through. Contingency funds were approved for Nigeria Center for Disease Control, about $2.7 million, nearly $1 billion naira, with an additional $6.5 billion set aside for purchasing and investing in test kits and essentially rollout of isolation centers and to train medical personnel. We've seen import duty waivers now granted to pharmaceutical firms. The plan is to roll that out progressively, so both on the drug manufacturing as well as medical equipment, so that the speed and the cost at which those equipment land would be less prohibitive. Regulated prices have been, the prices have been reduced. And we understand that some type of automatic formula has been introduced, which some will interpret to mean a removal of subsidies. We've seen a grant of 10 billion released to increase capacity to manage the outbreak, although I was informed that not all of that money has been released of the 10 billion that was approved. On the monetary side, we've seen the adjustments in the exchange rates, official and e-window. We've seen a reduction in the rates at which the central bank provides funding through the intervention windows. It's also created a 50 billion credit scheme for MSMEs and households, and has injected quite a bit of liquidity into the banking system. We've also seen an introduction of forbearance with respect to the banking system as well, which would allow banks restructure some of the loans that are bound to be impacted by this thing. On our side, we think the scale of intervention might be weak, especially at the level of the states, who would obviously need support from the federal government. Household individuals are also going to be impacted severely. So those who are out of job would need some sort of support. How that will work again is anyone's guess. Businesses also need to be supported. On the exchange rate side, we think the adjustment is necessary, but I think needs to still happen a bit further. Otherwise, we're going to suffer further accretion in depletion of our reserves. And the access to intervention funds have to be designed in a way that makes it really accessible for those who really need it. So I'll just go to the third section, which is really putting it all together and saying, okay, what can people do in the course of 2020 vis-a-vis investing? So external shocks have two key impacts for us. One is inflation. We expect inflation to trend up. And what this means is that investment returns must exceed this sort of range of 11% to 12%. The exchange rate obviously has begun to depreciate. I don't see it reversing. And what this means is that essentially, if we're looking at investment options, the most important thing right now for any portfolio manager or investor would be capital preservation. Returns would be an added bonus. So if you're looking to preserve capital, some of the things we think would be attractive could be sovereign Eurobonds. So something that allows you to invest in instruments that provide a hedge against devaluation. Local currency debt also is going to be attractive. So we expect increased borrowings by government to fund deficits. And what that means is that they obviously have to offer sufficiently high returns to be able to beat inflation in order to attract those pockets of liquidity. We also think it's important to limit your exposure to equities. If you must buy equities, you must have professional advice and be very particular about what you're getting into. And we expect to see some lower exposure to the real sector, particularly on account of investing. In order to achieve resilience amid downturns, there are three broad sort of themes that guide investing. So first is portfolio diversification. A diversified portfolio is something that helps you deal with shocks. If you had 100% of your wealth in one sector of the economy, and that sector is particularly badly hit, you will take, a very serious beating. But where you had, say for sake of argument, 20% in 5 different sectors, to aggregate your entire 100%, portfolio, 1 or 2 may be very badly hit, but one may be sort of neutral, and then you might find that 1 or 2 may actually be able to benefit from such a crisis. What that means, therefore, is if you're going to do this, I'm not sure that this is the time to. However, these are guiding principles to invest in. Second, obviously, is hedging. So if your business has FX exposures, maybe you have foreign currency imports or supplies, or you have foreign currency debt, you have to find a way to hedge, and then try and limit your exposure to those. Is important, as well as while trying to gain exposure to assets that are, in FX, and to preserve value. The third and most important is to build buffers. So as households, as businesses, it's important that at any point in time you have some sort of cash buffer to ensure that you can weather a storm. One of the biggest challenges with business is no matter how beautiful, how great your product is, no matter how profitable your operations are, the moment you run out of cash, you're dead. So in order to build a recession-proof portfolio, I've outlined 5 different buckets of assets that one would look at. I mentioned it just going ahead before. Instruments of well-rated countries and corporates in foreign currency, Eurobonds being an example, provide a good hedge for the currency investing. Mutual funds that are actively managed by fund managers, especially if they are dollar denominated, again, are particularly important asset classes to look out for. On the domestic bond side, again, when we talk about building buffers and holding some cash, it's not so much I leave it in the bank, but you've got to be able to take advantage of instruments that are close to cash. Whereas you should also be able to buy into some assets, in this case, domestic bonds that at least give you a chance to keep some of your local currency liquidity at yields that help to either match or at least exceed inflation. We think those are going to be good buckets, given the fact that government is going to have to borrow to fund this deficit. On the equity side, this is where a lot of caution is advised, but typically for those who are savvy and know what they're doing, you can actually make quite a bit of money on here. We'll typically advise that investing in resilient companies or companies that typically will be described as defensive is what one has to look out for. And it's always a help or a great support if those companies have foreign currency assets as well. And finally, I think this is where perhaps some of the greatest opportunities lies on the alternative investments class. So opportunities along several value chains, especially agriculture, is something that has begun to open up, and I think people are quite excited about it. Thankfully, the Securities and Exchange Commission introduced regulations at the exposure draft level, and for those of us in the industry, which is seeking to now help regulate that space and provide a bit of security and comfort to investors. To our mind, just the final section, what attractive sectors do we see amid COVID? So for those who obviously have paid attention, you can tell that telecoms is clearly one of those sectors that stands to benefit, if for nothing else, from an increased use of data and increased use of talk time. Obviously, as people are locked in and shut in, businessmen, families have to communicate via telephone and via video conferencing tools more often. The health and pharmaceutical sector obviously is well positioned to take advantage of this. If you add on that the fact that government has provided some bit of intervention to support that sector, then it means that you are in the good. Some leading food and consumables companies will also be well positioned. The IT industry, of course, here is not just about the telcos; it's about those who provide infrastructure. So cable companies, fiber optic companies, those who provide hardware and to some degree software would also do well. And lastly, I think the residential real estate market is also likely to see a bit of resilience on account of the fact that I think going forward, the world of work has changed, and we would increasingly see companies adopt remote work as a policy for some staff who perhaps stay in far-flung locations where they commute too many hours to and from offices, so long as productivity can be guaranteed. The rest of the document essentially just talks about some detail, look at PE ratio multiples and how they've consistently declined from 2017, therefore presenting opportunities. Again, we looked at risk ratings for different sectors. Agri, we think, should perhaps do well. In agri, for example, I can talk about in 2016, Nigeria's palm oil producers, the Kumu and Presco, saw their sales volume more than triple on account of the fact that palm oil is a key ingredient in the manufacture of a lot of the personal and skincare products, bathing soap, body creams, and all. So whereas the companies who operated here, the big FMCG blue chip companies that manufacture some of those products, could no longer access FX to purchase this oil and import it, the local producers obviously were able to cash in on that. And I think the other sectors more or less speak to themselves. I understand I'm out of time, so I will just very quickly wrap up by saying, on the fixed income side, we talked about the expectations for higher increased issuances by the federal government and seeing that yields have to go up in order to match inflation. So both the sovereign bonds, local currency bond issued by FGN and states, sovereign euro bonds, whether they're issued by Nigeria or other sovereigns, and then finally corporate bonds as well, whether local or foreign, are things to look out for. At this point, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to give it to share my perspectives, and hopefully we'll be able to address whatever questions you may have afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. We appreciate your time. The most important thing I got from Victor's presentation was we should try to diversify, we should try to hedge, we should try to build buffers. So let's call on OK now to, I think OK has sorted out his internet challenges. Please, can admin let in OK to have the floor, please?
Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me better now?
Everybody's on mute.
Okay. I'm sorry about what happened earlier. It's raining heavily in Abuja where I stay. And I guess that's why. I had 3 networks and I was switching from one to the other and none of them was working. I'm sorry about that. So I'll just get into it immediately. As I yesterday, 2,170 reported cases in the country. Ali has spoken very well about the oil price meltdown. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we saw that
do I still proceed to share your slide?
for delivery.
Do I still share your slide? Can I share
you
the
can.
slide?
Please do.
Okay.
Yes, please do. Go on.
Okay.
Yeah. So we saw that WTI for May delivery was sold at negative numbers. And we've seen some currency devaluation by the central bank. Yeah, Kingsley, go on. Yeah. Okay, so that devaluation, we think it will, more of it will happen because if you look at where the non-deliverable forwards put the value of the currency, you know that we expect more devaluation. And let's remember that the reserves are close to the point where CBN said they would have to devalue, which is $30 billion. Growth concerns, growth has been cut like it has in all other parts of the world. So Nigeria is not peculiar in this case. There have been market sell-offs. Year to date, the all share index has fallen 16.52%. And like Victor just said, if you're going into equities now, you have to be careful. You have to be well informed. You have to know what you're doing. CBN has announced a $3.5 trillion stimulus. The stimulus extends to different parts of the economy. Manufacturing, SMEs, and all that. And hopefully, that's what will get us out of trouble. Let's go straight to SMEs. Now is the time for cost efficiency. Very important. Kingsley, please move to the next slide. Yeah.
I'm on the next.
Cost efficiency. Yeah, I can see it. Thank you. So cost efficiency. It's time to cut costs. It's also time for optimal funding to find the optimal funding strategy, which is one of the things we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. It's time to find the best way to get funding for business. funding for working capital. It's time to reduce capital expenditures and run a lean organization. In terms of revenue diversification, this is the time to put on the thinking cap. Think about byproducts you can sell. Think about things you can add to what your offering presently is. And then asset optimization. This is the time also to sweat those assets. Make those assets earn as much as you can. Stretch them so that they can earn as much as possible. Let's go into the meat of the presentation. Kingsley, the next slide, please. Okay, thankfully, the central bank has come up with the 50 billion naira targeted credit facility. This facility is not really new. It's coming from the MSME Development Fund that the central bank had. It was set up in August 2013, and it was seeded with 220 billion naira. So out of the 220 billion naira, just 50 billion is being taken out for this targeted credit. The bank tells us that households and SMEs whose income are adversely affected by COVID-19 are eligible. We really don't know how they would determine which households and SMEs are affected adversely by COVID-19. If you ask me, I'll say that my household is affected, everyone's household, and all SMEs are affected. So I don't know what criteria they are going to use, but that's what they say. The idea is for SMEs, as many as possible, to take advantage of this. So those of us that have or run SMEs, this is a time to, you know, find a way to use this to help the business. Let's talk more about it. The loan tenor for working capital. So if you're applying for working capital, if you're applying for the loan for working capital, the tenor is for 1 year, and there's no option of rollover. But if you're applying for a term loan, the maximum is 3 years. The central bank says they will exit the funding in 2024. As per limits, the maximum loan limit for households is 3 million naira, and for SMEs it is 25 million naira. But you know, when I was introducing myself earlier, I said that I worked at the central bank. So using my sources in there, I asked them, because sometimes when they make these announcements, some of them are just what really obtains is not what you see. So my friends advised me that if I wanted to apply, it would be better to limit my household application to 1 million naira, and for SMEs 3 million naira. So if you're thinking of applying for these loans, I think that if you limit your application to 1 million naira for households and 3 million naira for SMEs, you stand a better chance of getting it. For working capital, it will be the maximum you can apply for is 25% of the average of 3 years annual turnover. So for companies who are not yet 3 years old, they will use 25% of the previous year's turnover. And then for the interest rate, the central bank, like all other loans that the central bank has given out before now, it's going to be 5%. 5% until the 28th of February. And then from the 1st of March, it moves to the normal 9% per annum. Note that for this fund, for the MSME fund, development fund that the central bank has, the central bank gives it to the financial institutions at 2%, and then they can on-lend to consumers at 9%. And this is the same case with this one. The only difference between this one and the usual thing is that the central bank has designated just one financial institution for the TCF, the Targeted Credit Facility. And that is the NESAL MFB. That's the microfinance bank owned or sponsored or promoted by NESAL, the CBN offshoot. Okay, Kingsley, next one, please.
I got you.
So the next question is, who will get this support from government. The first one, as always, since it's NESA, you know what it is. It's agriculture based. The first one is the value chain. You are packaging.
Hello, okay. Hello. Hello, okay. Or hello, do we have Victor on the line? Mr. Bisong? Can admin enable Mr. Bisong to continue on the case slide until we sort out the problem? Hello?
Hello, the host muted me. I was muted by the host.
It's better now. Sorry, please. Okay. Hello? We can hear you.
I was muted by the host. I was muted by the host.
Please continue, sir. We can hear you now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So the agricultural value chain is number one, followed by the hospitality industry, that's food and accommodation, health, airline service providers, manufacturing, value addition, and general commerce. General commerce, usually they pay more attention to products of Nigeria, products made in Nigeria. So that's where the emphasis is. I'm not saying they will not give loans to importers and all that, but if the products are made in Nigeria, you get more, you get some level of preference. Okay, please move to the next one, Kingsley. And how are these loans going to be processed? For the household, there will be a submission of applications to NESAL. The applications will be processed by them according to the guidelines given to them by CBN.
Hello.
And the host is muting me.
Okay, I'll talk to the host, please. Continue, please.
Tell the host to tell the host to take notes. Okay, so like I was saying, the application for the household and the SME, parts of it will be made directly to NESAL, and NESAL will process and send to CBN for approvals, and CBN will give the approvals. So let us look at some of the things that will be needed for the loans. The first one is movable assets. Of course, CBN, through the National Collateral Registry, has made it easy for people to use, for SMEs to use movable assets as collateral for loans. So all you need to do is get those assets registered. But the good thing there is that you don't need to do it yourself. All you need to do is submit the receipts with which you used to buy those assets, or a sort of valuation, something that gives NESAL a kind of value for the assets, and they can register that asset on the National Collateral Registry. Another one is just documents of title in case it's not a movable asset. If it's land, if it is a building and all that, you can give them that also. Deed of debenture, stocks, whatever you have in that, along those lines, that's securities, evidence of securities. And also, you need to give them an irrevocable domiciliation of proceeds. What it means is that you have to give them a document showing that you have authorized your bank to, you're going to be domiciling all the proceeds, or most they will give you, most likely at NESAL MFB. And the guarantors, NESAL will give you who is acceptable, the guarantors that are acceptable. Personal guarantee of the promoter. So this comes mostly as a letter guaranteeing that you will pay back the funds. And then life insurance of the key man in the business, most likely the promoter of the business. And then finally, comprehensive insurance cover over the assets. So these are not really onerous. They're not really onerous. They are things that an SME can easily procure. So on a final note, I'm aware that I have spent most of my time. On a final note, what do you need to do as an SME at this time? Kingsley, please move the slides. Kingsley, please.
I am trying to.
Yeah. I'm done with this one. You move to now. That's where I talked about what you need. Okay, yeah. So the first one is to keep costs low. Keep costs low. Drive costs and operational efficiency in the business. Spend less than you earn. The next one is to grow sales strategically. I've talked about sweating the assets. I've talked about trying to see how much more you can get from the byproducts. The third one is borrow only what you need. So I talked about being able to borrow 25 million. If you don't need 25 million, you don't need to borrow 25 million, so that there won't be a debt overburden, which usually that is the biggest problem SMEs have. Prioritize loan repayments. I must mention here that if you have a loan already running with a bank in Nigeria, the central bank is still going to use their normal prudential guidelines to make decisions about this loan. So if the SME has a loan running and they have been servicing the loans the usual way, as the CBN has a credit rating mechanism, or CRM. They call it the CRM. They use it to check on loans by debtors in the country. So they're going to also use that to do the assessments. And then invest monies borrowed intelligently. Make sure you do your project appraisal and feasibility very well before you go in. And then, of course, you have to do all you can as an SME to survive. Usually at this time, the number one thing is survival. This is not the time, like I said before, to invest in very expensive or to do very expensive capital projects as an SME. I thought to put in the links. These links are just these are the links you can use to access the NESAL site. And they have been saying that they are experiencing, Kingsley, please move to the next slide. They're experiencing some downtime due to the traffic. Of course, in Nigeria, we have 17 million SMEs, 34 million MSMEs. That's when you add the micros, they become 34 million. So imagine that just 10% of those are hitting this website. So they've been saying that they have a bit of issues. So they have given an alternative link that you can use to access it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, okay. This is very helpful. So ladies and gentlemen, you can see there's a special link for us. Huh?
Yeah, I'm done, Kingsley. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Host,
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Host, I hope I'm not muted. Okay, so thank you very much, okay.
Thank you.
So we will share your slides so that people can have this link and read it and digest it, because it looks like this is the more updated information than what is available to the public. So we will try to share the slide amongst ourselves by the admin. Now we move to the question and answer session. We spent a lot of time. So can we now just raise questions to the panel? Hold on, please. I have to, first of all, call on Ikenna. Can admin unmute Ikenna to ask his question? Ikenna, you have to ask the 3 questions together.
Okay. Thanks, presenters. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
we can.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I think most of my questions are for Victor. Thank you all for your presentations. Victor, I have 3 questions. The first one is, what do you know about agro partnerships? And the second one is, in recommending investment in health and pharmaceuticals, do you mean like shares purchase? Could you please put some more light to this? And the third one, when you advise caution against equity, can you break this down in lay terms? Thank you.
Okay. Victor, do
Okay.
you want to proceed here?
Yes, so just taking down the notes. If I got them correctly, the first one was about agro partnerships, what my thoughts are. Second is about healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and whether I'm recommending purchasing, investing in their equities. And then last was about equities itself. When I say being careful, I don't know if I got the question, all the questions down.
You did.
Okay.
The second one
so,
is, hello?
Yeah.
You know, when you say investing, what do you mean by, what kind of investment do we put into that sector or any sector you recommend?
Okay, so thank you, Ikenna, for the questions, and I'll try and answer them very quickly and succinctly. First one, agro partnerships. I think someone has already mentioned the fact that they are more or less the newest asset class. I did hint at the fact that the Securities and Exchange Commission has introduced regulations to help guide the operations of players in that ecosystem. What they represent essentially is a bridge between the guys who cultivate agri-produce, farmers, and the markets where they are consumed. The whole objective being that rather than, so a lot of farmers have difficulty accessing financing to cultivate and to do what they need to do in terms of purchasing seedlings, paying for the help of companies that can provide extension services and all that. So by acting as a bridge, they take capital from investors and give it directly to the farmers, and in some way guarantee those farmers offtake at a price that is better than what they will find when they typically will cultivate by cycles, and then see the boom and bust that happens with when there's a surge and there's a surplus of produce and when there's a glut. Now, as with all things, there are a few that started out initially that have perhaps the most developed ecosystems, have the infrastructure to provide safety and security, and we've seen a proliferation of several others. I cannot here begin to mention any names of any ones that I think are good or bad. However, the SEC is now trying to provide some bit of clarity and regulation to that space so that anybody who is making an investment in what is essentially a crowdfunding platform is safe and secure, at least understands the risk of what they're going into. The question about investing, and I talked about healthcare, pharmaceuticals, talked about telcos. The easiest way to invest in those places is obviously through owning shares or buying equity. If you wanted exposure, for example, to the palm oil producers, they are listed entities, their stocks are fairly liquid and they trade. So you go and set up a brokerage account and buy equity in either Okumu or Presco or any of those other names. Same with healthcare and pharmaceuticals. Of course, it doesn't also stop you as an individual or a club of individuals getting together and determining that perhaps we want to make a direct investment, either through making an investment directly in farmland that is adjacent to some of those, agro producers, or you go and invest in the health supply chain. For example, healthcare today, I'm talking with a couple of friends and we're thinking about creating a fund, liquidity fund vehicle for guys who provide or produce or import certain key medical equipment, because there is demand today for those equipment, but they're struggling to find FX to bring in equipment that are required clearly, even though there's now a lifting of embargoes and that. So investing can be either way. You can either do it at the micro level, investing directly through equity, or you get into a club and collectively you guys pick sectors that you're comfortable with, have some bit of domain expertise, have the relationships that are required to build the value chain, and then you can begin to actively develop businesses in those areas. The last note on equities, and when I say care, the crash of 2008 essentially happened because there was a lot of uninformed investment going on. People were dabbling into the equities market with very limited knowledge and expertise. More often than not, there was a lot of joke, and I actually heard it live. I used to live somewhere in the Festac axis at the time, and I was walking through a market, and I heard the market woman tell her neighbor about how she doubled her money in 6 weeks and how that's the newest way to double money. That was March 2008. I sold all my stocks the next week after I heard that, which for me was fortuitous because that was the peak of the market and everything went downhill from then on. So when we talk about investing in stock, it's about being careful. And I'll give one or two examples. in 2016, I have a client in my firm. He's a wealthy, entrepreneur. He came to my head of trading and said, "Look, guys, I need advice on what to buy." After they spoke to him, he took ₦1 billion and went and put it in First Bank at the time. And we were wondering, Oga, you have to diversify this in. I can't just buy one stock. First Bank at the time was struggling with, bad loans and was undergoing some very tough times in trying to clean up its books. And consequentially, the stock price took a major beating, went from nearly 10 naira down to about 3 naira. And he said, look, that given all the plethora of steps that have been taken, the measures the bank has taken to clean up, there's only one way he sees this thing going, and it's up. And he's ready to take a big bet and not just be a partial, gamble. Suffice to say, the stock climbed to nearly 11 naira. He sold for 3 times what he put in, and rather twice of what he put in, got that out, and still left a bit of skin in that game, and was able to use the proceeds to do something else. Now, he understood the fundamentals of what he was getting into. He understood the market timing and cycles, and chose to take a bet. We've seen valuations come off significantly in the market, pharmaceuticals. We've seen valuations in the banking space, valuations in the industrial. I'm talking stuff like, so for example, MTN is the second one I'll give you. MTN was listed at 90 naira effectively, but because of a lack of liquidity, it traded up to about 150 and then dropped about 130, 125 on average. That stock went back to 90 naira in the immediate wake of the lockdown and the COVID, pandemic, healthcare interventions. However, Q1 numbers for MTN have come out, and we've seen both subscriber numbers go up 4 million. We've seen an expansion in 15% in EBITDA from about 53 to nearly 65. That company is minting cash like no man's business. The stock price went down to IPO price of 90. It's about 100, 110 now. If you ask my view, I think if you talk to your financial advisor, they'll tell you, look, there's what you call the fundamental valuation, where intrinsically, based on the performance of this company, or how should the price of this stock trade? That stock is something that should be trading in 170 to 200 naira range. And I think once the market begins to catch on, it will begin to see that uplift. The challenge, however, and this is why we talk about being careful, is the amount of liquidity that was available, non-discretionary spending, or liquidity available for investment spending would obviously suffer in the wake of salary adjustments and job losses. So would we see the same level of participation by investors in the equities market? Maybe not. But if you have the capacity to play the long game, and I'm talking minimum 18 to 24 months, then if you have some spare cash, there's certain select stocks with the right advice you can go into, and you would at least see 20, 30, potentially 50% upside. In some cases, you might be able to double that investment with time, but it has to be guided, and you have to be sure of what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. I think in summary, Victor is just trying to say the caution element means you need to be sure that the time horizon that you have to wait for is something you can endure, because we are not certain that people will still have spending power within the next few months, particularly when people are expected to lose jobs. We will, assuming we had much time, like we anticipated, would have discussed in detail on which sectors are going to do well down to the level of value chain, to say who is heavy on data, on sales of data, because such a player is likely going to be the outperformer among the telecom operators and stuff like that. But we can organize this in another session and look further into details for those that are interested in investing. And then let's allow Mr. Jideofor Agbo to ask his question. Jideofor. Hello, Jideofor, you're online.
Okay, hello.
We can hear you, Jideofor.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, Jide.
Thanks. It has been a very wonderful presentation so far. I actually wanted to ask the manufacturing opportunities that have been presented due to the impact of COVID. But going through the slides, I saw okay, the opportunities there. But you see, the problem I have, because I myself, we've been into manufacturing, and we encounter getting cash like the SME, the CBN funding it's not as easy as it's put, because if you start applying for these funds, it takes years to get. In 2014, we applied for a loan from Bank of Industry, just about some thousands of dollars, but it took us 2-3 years to get that loan. By the time we got it, the Naira was devalued, and the loan didn't make sense anymore. But now, apart from just saying CBN releasing these guidelines, how can people be sure that once they have the collateral, they have the securities, that these loans can be processed? Because I believe that however we look at it, it's very important that people also go into manufacturing, especially in the agri sector, or even manufacturing of other things. Because in the long term, there is so much opportunity there. For example, we manufacture bolts and nuts in Enugu. All this while we've been struggling, but now because of this COVID, it has also presented opportunity, because people have been coming to us. Most of these oil companies are coming to say, come, Lola, you guys manufacture in Nigeria, please supply this boat. This is something that we could never have. We didn't even believe it's going to happen, but it's working now. So the manufacturing business is actually very profitable, but you have to play it out well, take your time. But in this week, I'm still thinking of other opportunities that this could present in the long term, this COVID, because things are really going to change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jidofa. Just to make it easy, I'll just try to say what we are thinking of as organizers is to also have a plan on how people can be collectively guided in making their submission and application for loan. I will try to reach out to some contacts within CBN and also work with OK, and let's see whether we can have a group organized review process for maybe the people may charge or not charge anything. Let's go to, and then regarding the potential opportunities in this season, there are many opportunities. And before we end, I'm just going to point out to some that I've heard on, people discuss. Some of the things you're going to find out is that in the developed world, they're already working towards testing of millions of people. Currently in Nigeria, we are just testing people in our hundreds. What kits do they need for that testing for millions? Because if this doesn't end in this first wave, by second wave, anybody that's selling the testing kits is likely going to make a lot of money. What kits? And then for data, what are we doing about the data? Who is selling all the data that people are using? And then for those who are doing daily deliveries online, we may say their prices are already maxed out. What about those that are selling the packaging equipment to the Amazons of this world, to their Jumia or whatever that is used locally? We need to find out this kind of companies, whether they are listed, how do we participate in the profits they have to. So there are many things that can be done, either as an investor or potential manufacturer. But that could be another session, because this is the maiden edition and we had to do the presentation first to get everybody to be on the same intellectual plane before we start the conversation. Okay. Let's welcome Mr. John Azubike to ask his question. Thank you.
Just confirm.
Hello, John.
Again has unmuted me. Okay. So I wanted to ask you questions. Okay, so my first question is for Victor or maybe OK. So Victor in his presentation mentioned that there's an exposure draft for agri crowdfunding business. I don't know if that exposure draft is in the public domain already. So either he or OK could share with us. We'd very much appreciate that after the call. Then the second question is to Ali. So I don't know what Ali's level of exposure to Nigeria's oil and gas business. So I wanted to hear his views on the smaller operators in Nigeria's oil and gas. So by operators, I mean the producers, and how he thinks they will fare through this pandemic period.
Hi, thanks for your question. I think the small operators generally are more nimble. So when it comes to operational efficiency, small operators actually fare better than large operators by far. From the experiences I've had personally with small operators, they tend to be able to navigate the playing field very quickly. They can shut in wells and restart wells very quickly. I would bet that generally you'll find small operators will start looking for other small operators to merge and work together to optimize their resources. And they can do that in a much shorter time frame and become more successful than larger operators. The risks really are going to be for the big players. The big players are going to be on a per barrel basis, they're going to lose more. Small operators generally don't. Also, even the standards, for example, in Nigeria, there's a level of standards that you have to operate by. However, the smaller operators will operate at the very minimum in most cases, whereas the larger operators will tend to work on that and beyond, closer to international standards, which also costs more. Smaller operators will tend to utilize more cost-effective production techniques and technologies, whereas larger operators will go for the Schlumbergers, the Halliburtons for services, and it just becomes ineffective. So I think in general, my view is if I wanted longer-term upside, and I would try and find a cash-rich, well, not cash-rich, but somebody who has a sustainable business model as a smaller operator, if I'm going to be looking at investing in that field. Obviously, that comes with risks. Smaller operators tend to be more debt-heavy, and if they do go towards the equity route to raise capital, or if they need to raise capital by the equity markets, then you go into what we call a spiral of decline. What they'll do, they'll dilute over a 5 to 10 year period, and the original investors who thought they had a great idea will be left with nothing. And even if there is upside, and if they're able to turn it around, I would say 90%, 80% of the examples I've seen don't turn it around if they go down that cycle. They will not make money if you're too early. And it goes back to what Victor was saying with regards to cycles and caution. It really will be a matter of timing before you can really take any kind of look, whether it's small or large operators. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, it does, largely. Thanks very much, Ali. Okay, so Kingsley, just to confirm, we'll get the exposure draft from OK or Victor on agri crowdfunding.
Okay, so this is Victor. Thanks for your question. It says QQuest or Quest. The way the SEC operates, when it wants to provide or wants to introduce new rules regarding a certain segment of the market, it would normally share an exposure draft of those rules first with the players in the ecosystem. So it will talk to, in the case of crowdfunding, which is essentially a capital raising element of what is the investment banking cycle. It will share with issuing houses, it will share with the Capital Market Solicitors Association, it will share with treasurers and all the other players in the ecosystem who would think about all of the various angles with which those rules impact the market. In some cases, and I think in this case, it has perhaps reached out to some of the early operators that have set up some agri platform or the other, or agri tech platform, as it's quite commonly called. I think that following the feedback to those draft rules, it will then go back and then publish those rules on its website and would make the links available to the market. As things stand, we have given our feedback to the SEC. It has taken them in, and I am not at liberty to disclose. Other than COVID, usually what happens is we typically have every quarter a capital markets community meeting town hall where all the players in the industry, including the financial system, from the CBN to the DMO to PENCOM, everybody's in the same room, and we discuss the issues that affect the markets, financial markets particularly, and the financial ecosystem. So in between quarters, after a rule is exposed, industry players have provided feedback. At those meetings, the feedback is debated and is ratified and finalized and subsequently published. It is my expectation, regardless of the fact that COVID is shut down, the SEC continues to work. And I think that sometime in Q3 of this year, those rules will be made public, all things being equal, at which point it becomes clear what's happening. But essentially,
right.
just to
Okay, if I may.
Okay.
Okay, if I may add.
Okay, please.
Go on.
Thank
Go
you.
on, Victor.
Okay,
So if I may add. Yeah, if I may add, Victor is correct. I happen to sit on the committee that makes those rules, so I can tell you that we've started working on the comments received, just as Victor has explained. We've been working on it for about 2 weeks now, of course using Zoom, and I can assure you that very soon those rules will be out. But for the person asking the question, even though the time we gave for the rules, for comments to come in has elapsed, you can still find those exposed rules on our website. So, and if you can look at them, if you have any comments, you can send them to me. And I assure you that I'll put them in and we can look at what's your comments.
All right,
Okay.
thanks.
So
Okay.
Victor,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Victor, as well.
Yeah, we are running short of time. Please let me just end with 2 questions, one for Okay and then one for Ali. So for Okay, the question for the day which was asked was, how can 2 scenarios actually, a working class professional who probably is working in the oil and gas, how can he diversify his situation, his portfolio or his income in this current situation so that he doesn't have a double whammy effect? What I'm saying is he doesn't want a situation whereby probably he's laid off, or maybe there's a problem with oil and gas sector, and then most of his money or stock are in that particular sector, or he's working in a bank and he's just laid off, but most of his investment is also in financial services industry, or all investments are in Naira, and at the moment he is also having challenges at work, sustaining his income. What do you advise people to do? And then for Mr. Ali, the question people are trying to find out from you is, if this curve stretches, how can a country like Nigeria, be able to protect or hedge itself because of this reason? Why the question is coming out is this. They said, if you're in OPEC, the quota that you can sell is limited by Saudi Arabia. You have to agree as a cartel. Now, if you cannot control quota, you cannot control price. How can a country meet their budget? What are people doing out there? There's a news article that came recently that showed that Mexico, I think it was Mexico, that made close to $5 billion from hedging in this current situation. Meanwhile, Nigeria borrowed close to that amount in this situation, and they both faced the same oil and gas situation, and they are mostly oil exporting people to countries too. So let's just find out what, I don't know if Mexico is very deep on oil like Nigeria, but they hedged and they made $5 billion. So people would like to know what your advice is. But let's start with Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kingsley. It's basically diversification, the basic ABC of investing, diversification. If you are employed in government, in CBN, in NNPC, where you are sure that your job is secure, then you can invest in stocks, you can invest in more risky assets. I would say when Victor was talking about how risky stocks are, I was going to say that that's where I'm swimming right now because I have a steady salary. But if you are like the gentleman that asked the question that is into manufacturing and things like that, then your investments should be in more secure assets, should be in a fixed income, in treasuries, in government bonds and things like that. So always diversify your positions. And the diversification you should look at your earnings and your investments as a complete portfolio, So your diversification should not just be for the investments alone, but also for your everyday earnings. So if you're in high risk business and you're also investing in equities, then you're really putting yourself at great risk. So I would say that if you're working in a bank, for instance, I would expect that you don't invest in your bank. I would, put my money in somewhere else, because what it means is that the basic source of earning, the bank, your salaries at the bank, is coming from the same industry where you're putting all your investments. So it's like putting all the eggs in one basket. So it's about diversification. And one good thing that we are doing in Abuja now is we're doing a lot of real estate. We find that it's been a bit okay. I don't advise, of course, a lot of real estate investment is debt capital, but you do it carefully. So you put a little here, put a little there, and at the end of the day, you'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. Ali.
Yes, Kingsley.
Mr. Ali, please. Yeah.
Sure. So with regards to the hedging and how to make the best out of a bad situation, it's very interesting. I mean, look, a lot of the times people will lose money and it's just paying insurance premium. And yes, Mexico, they made some money out of it. And likewise, even private entities like Porsche made money in the past. They would hedge. Generally, hedging through derivatives can be quite expensive. Now, there are structured products which reduce your expense to that. However, the timing of hedging also needs to be there, and that can only really be done with the right analytics. Right now, if you wanted to have a downside product hedge, it will cost you too much because the volatility is too high. If you wanted something further out into the 6-month time frame, you're paying too much theta, you're paying too much time value on your product. So hedging generally, the best hedge, honestly, from what I've seen, is having good analytics and strategy and being able to foresee things happening. If you had the opportunity, by looking at the China example, by understanding the analytics of how much storage capacity is there, what the impacts are globally, it's going to go down. Goldman Sachs predicted it. And so, Goldman Sachs were predicting minus $10 on the futures. So ultimately, even now, if you wanted to ask me, where do you think oil prices will go down now? You can be in a panic and say it's going to go down again, but ultimately markets will correct themselves. They'll find an equilibrium. What generally will happen is people will shut down, production will naturally decline, and then by the time COVID is recovered from, production will be too low, and then you have a huge spike up again, and then by the time people catch up to restart their wells, then it will stabilize. Generally, I would see it around about $50, $60 mark is where there's a good balance in the global economy in the let's say 1 to 2 year time frame. I think it will probably go back up to 30 by the end of the year, if not a little bit more, 30 to 40 mark by the end of the year, as people start to shut down. I mean, we've already seen it start. The rig count in the US has collapsed. And so, the worry about hedging may not be the question right now, especially for downside hedging. But when markets do stabilize, there should be a lesson learned here to keep an eye on things. And those who were caught out this time round were because they had their eye off the ball. All you needed to do is look outside and look what's happening, and it's going to happen. But it's a case whether you acted or not. And in fact, the best of companies didn't act. Mexico is one of the few countries that did act, but it's very, very few. People had their minds elsewhere, and often they're put off by the cost of it. The cost of hedging is just too high unless you have a very good derivatives expert or a very good banker who's going to be able to advise you on a structured product which will minimize your cost, then derivatives for the average national oil company or oil and gas company in general will be something that they're not going to invest money in until it's too late. And when I say invest money in, that also invests money in the necessary capacity internally to understand what products they need when they need to execute. If you wanted to keep having it rolling, it would cost you too much over the long term, because these kind of events don't happen all too often.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to give the floor to Mr. Ifebunando to ask his question. But before we pass the opportunity to Mr. Joe Ifebunando, I'd just like to answer Mr. Odo's question, which, okay, he didn't address to any specific panelist, but the question is, yes, the question is whether it's possible to assess equivalent loan internationally outside the borders of Nigeria, relative in terms of stimulus. And I would say it's even better if you are in the Western world, because most of the loans, they are variable rates, and the policy rates have come down so much that you probably will be borrowing at less than 5% if you know, and even they can defer for you. I have my credit cards, they've written to many people I know, and even myself, for us to defer till several months down the line, and the rates have been adjusted. You don't even need to apply for anything, and then subsequently you can also approach the government if you're properly in the net to see what to, you know, depending on which class of, you know, participation that you're doing in the economy. Now, before we open to Joe, I also like to point out one thing that OK and Ali mentioned. It's about, first, Ali is talking about hedging for the country. OK is talking about diversification, that individuals need to find a way to diversify their income. And when you are averse to going into equities or bond, at least for what I think Victor OK mentioned earlier, the fact that the forward rates, Naira exchange forward rates are not predicting a very good future, indicates that there could be a second devaluation. That tells us, even in this forum, that perhaps we need to find alternative currency to hedge with, or to bank our money with for some time, to store value, so that we don't lose it in the next round of devaluation if it happens. At the moment, I think the last check, we saw that the total borrowing was already about $27 billion, while National Reserve was about $33 or so billion. We need to be careful and monitor these indicators and see how we take position. So Mr. Ifebunando, please, I hope you're ready.
Yes, and thank you very much. I just have, I guess, two questions to each speaker, and given the time that we've taken, the very short answers are acceptable. Ali, I think my questions to you will be: one, you mentioned the profitable production in terms of Saudi's operations. What I want to know is, are we talking about Saudi having a robust operating cost regime, or is it comparing their operating cost against, well, they are known to have a massive cash pile via their sovereign wealth fund. So is it just a comparison against that? And secondly, I think in terms of investment in the oil and gas space, reserve-based lending is going to suffer, obviously, because financial covenants are not going to be met for no fault of the, I guess, companies. Do you see companies being willing to fund, I guess, mergers or let me say, a collaboration between two existing entities who are maybe small players? I think for Victor, my question is, given the FDI that people have brought into Nigeria and the strain on the Naira, would there be any positive impact to, I guess, the equities market? Because most people will probably flock towards, I guess, fixed income instruments. But where that becomes saturated, do you think it will positively impact the equities market? And two, for those of us who are retail investors, treasury bills have been scrapped. What else in terms of those money market instruments would be available for us to invest in? And I guess okay, two questions. One, I'm totally confused as to what the definition of a household would be in terms of this 50 billion credit facility. Is it two spouses and their kids, or is it just anybody who owns a home? And I think the second question would be, given the lack of, I guess, information and credit structure in our banking sector, even the cost of making those assessments and the potential of abuse, could this 50 billion actually be better put into capital infrastructure to make sure that those who are operating have, I guess, a better space to generate income? Because the way I'd say it might actually end up being money down the drain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just to answer your question, so with regards to operating costs in Saudis, Saudi operating costs is lower for a number of reasons, but actually it's more to do with geology, we can say. So I wouldn't say that it's because Nigeria operating models are substantially different, but it's more to do with the depth that they're drilling to, as well as the flow rates per well. So your variable operating cost is less. So they will have a higher fixed base, and the more they produce, the marginal cost is less. As well as conducting business in Saudi is a lot easier. For example, when it comes to logistics, when it comes to bringing on board resources, taxes, the regimes there are a little bit easier to navigate than in Nigeria, and that helps with keeping costs low as well. There is scope for Nigeria to reduce costs, obviously, but it will take some work. With regards to funding or reserve-based lending, funding of entities, I think for larger institutions, for larger players, they will rely on their own reserves, they will rely on their future revenues. They don't generally go to market. For smaller players, I think there will be some consolidation. They will look towards capital markets, whether it's through debt or equity. But as you mentioned, right now will not be the time. Now, historically, whenever there's a downturn in oil and gas, the opportunity lies once the dust has settled, and then people are very fast to move. So I would say on a post-COVID situation, when stability is back and oil is back up to maybe $40, $50, $35, $40 if you're pushing it, you then have 6 to 12 months to create some investment opportunities. Otherwise, everyone's invested and everyone's got good opportunities. They'll pick up the good assets cheap. But right now, I can tell you the markets and appetite for investment is low, especially production assets that have a higher operating cost, and you can forget about exploration right now. I hope that's answered your questions.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, hello.
Yep.
Yeah, Victor, I think you have wanted to say something?
Yeah, it was, well, Joe had two questions.
Yeah, the second, yeah, please.
The first one, I wasn't quite sure if he said FDI or FPI, but essentially he talked about, the question was around how the flow of capital would help shape the direction for equities market or fixed income. I'm not quite sure I got that question correctly. But the second one is a bit more straightforward. It's essentially about retail investors and their access to investment assets, including T-bills and such mutual funds. where returns have more or less cratered. So the question is, what alternatives are there? I think the thing is, for every account an investor has with an investment bank, there are alternatives. So if you spoke to your investment bank, they'll probably show you other things beyond just T-bills. I'm trying to be careful not to market Afrinvest particularly here, but even though the T-bills market began to decline, that decline essentially is market-wide, and it's affected everybody because the central bank chose to prioritize investor monies, FPI money coming into the markets to buy OMO versus T-bills. So by shutting out local retail investors, local non-bank financial institutions, PFAs, asset managers, and the likes from the OMO market, you have a bifurcation of short-term instruments where the yield on OMO today for a commensurate paper is north of 10%, 11, 12%, whereas the T-bills market, it's anywhere between 2 and 4%, which is significantly undercutting inflation at 12. So it's not a good look for retail investors. We have a dollar retail mutual fund we've just launched for investors that has entry barrier set at $1,000. So anybody can come in at that level. Target yield is between 6 and 7.5% in USD terms, net of all fees. So a lot of our clients are quite excited about it and lapping that up. But more importantly, within our asset management business, for example, we would typically look for very bespoke opportunities that open up in the economy with players who have very stable businesses, well positioned in their sectors, but sometimes looking for funding, and we can package, very dedicated or very sort of bespoke investment products around that for discerning clients. The challenge with such products sometimes is the minimum entry barriers could be anywhere between 20 and 25 million. And maybe at the retail end, 5 million naira, which is again not quite retail, but that's the challenge with that one. But there are alternatives if you speak to your banker. And Joe, I know you have an account with us, so if you speak to me after this, I'll give you a bit more detail as to some of these things. I hope that answers the question.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the regulator in me kicks in, notes that Victor said target return. So they are not allowed to promise any returns. It's just a target. Please take note of that. Yeah, and then to my question, what is a household? Unfortunately, CBN did not define what a household is, but I would assume that it's a family unit. So a family unit can be a father and children, can be mother and children, can be father, mother, and children, just a family unit. And that's what a household would be, but they didn't define it in the circular that they sent out. The second question is with the lack of data and the cost of verifying applications and all that, wouldn't it be better to put this money in infrastructure? Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, this money is not new money. It is money sourced from the MSME Development Fund. It's part of the 220 billion in that fund. So what they did was for COVID-19 to say, okay, we're going to map out 50 billion to be disbursed faster, make it easier for people to get it, and then reduce the make the terms easier. Let me put it that way. Okay, so it's not like they got new money from anywhere, and yeah, I think that personally, I think that the 50 billion is very small. If you look at the number of SMEs we have, I gave you the number earlier, 17.4 million, and they say when you add the micros, when you make it MSME, it becomes 34 million. Of them in the country, and then add the households, and you see that the 50 billion is peanuts, which is why I had to ask those I know in there what they really want to give out, and those were the numbers I gave you earlier. So I think that it's not bad to have this. I think that this will be a lifeline for many businesses. and it would, and I believe that if they want to do the right thing, if they want this money to get to the people whom it should get to, it will get there. So it remains for us to see what will happen. I can assure you that the intent behind it is very good. It remains the implementation. Let's hope they do it well this time.
All right, thank you very much. Okay. Are any other final comments we need to from any of the presenters before we round up? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for this wonderful experience. This is the first edition. We're sorry we spent a lot more time than we anticipated, but we believe that in the coming sessions, we will be able to keep to time. However, if you have questions or documents or information you still need from any of the presenters, please get in touch with the admin. We'll collect everything together and get a response for you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. A night, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone.